Luncheon with Anya Prusa, who is our speaker. And before joining the Brazil Institute, where she works in the Wilson Center, Anya was in Albright Stonebridge Group at U.S. Department of State's Office of Brazilian and Southern Cone Affairs. Okay. She just provided briefly this kind of overview of what she'll be talking about today. Almost exactly a year ago, Brazil elected a new president, the staunch conservative Bolsonaro. The former congressman and army captain ran an anti-establishment campaign, tapping into widespread frustration over corruption, violence, and Brazil's struggling economy. Yet his first year in office has been marked by more political controversy than big policy victories. The government's response to devastating forest fires in the Amazon this summer undermined much of Brazil's international credibility and the hope for a strengthening of ties with the United States. We look forward to hearing from Anya. Please welcome her now.
Oh, great, I'm live. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. Brazil is a topic that I always love talking about, so I'm really happy to be with you here today. I first went to Brazil back in 2007, 3 years in São Paulo, not too bad. And I went with my then boyfriend, who's Brazilian. And I fell in love with Brazil. And I also fell in love with him. We're married now. But Brazil, for me, was something that I was just incredibly curious about. It's a country that has a lot of parallels with the United States. We're both large, multiracial democracies struggling with a lot of the same issues. And so I knew I wanted to learn more. So it's really exciting now to be at the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in DC. We're a foreign policy, international affairs think tank. And we do a lot to try to inform people about what's going on in Brazil and Brazil-US relations. And right now, one of the biggest questions that we get asked is this one. What on earth happened to Brazil? For those of you who follow Brazil or have seen Brazil in the headlines, you might remember that 10 years ago, this is what Brazil looked like to us. Okay? President Lula, who's standing there next to Obama, was incredibly popular, 80% approval rating, international darling. You know, there was a sense that Brazil had arrived. And then just a few years later, this. And then this. Corruption scandals, a president impeached, her successor indicted for corruption. And finally, last year, Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain with very limited experience, won the presidency of Brazil. So what happened? I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, what happened in the 2000s and the early 2010 to give you some context. But the short of it is that Brazilians were fed up with their political system. They were fed up with the traditional political parties. They were looking at their lives and they were seeing that their own economic situation was a lot worse than it had been, 5, 10 years ago, and that things didn't look like they were getting any better. Now, in the 2000s, the story was completely the opposite. Brazil was doing really well. The economy was growing, poverty was falling. 20 million Brazilians moved from poverty to the middle class. And this was because of profound government efforts through conditional cash transfer programs and other initiatives that really became a model for the world. People were looking at Brazil and saying the government is doing what it's supposed to be doing. But as you can see, economic growth was actually hit or miss, right? Some years were really good and some years were not. And so the average trend going here, was pretty good. There were some slower years. This is the global financial crisis. And then you can see Brazil rebounded really quickly. But then we get to 2011, 2012, and this is the end of the commodities boom. And Brazil relied really heavily on commodities, on exporting, coffee, soy to China, beef. And so as commodity prices started to fall, Brazilian GDP started to fall. And they didn't have good education, they didn't have good infrastructure, and so without the boost from commodities, the economy just went south. For a little while, the government tried to boost spending through tax breaks and other short-term measures, but it didn't work. And by 2015, Brazil was in the worst recession in its history. Now, this wasn't the only bit of bad news, right? So Brazil hosted the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. So it was spending a lot of money, even while it was in the middle of a recession, trying to build stadiums and swimming pools. And the Brazilian people just got really fed up. So in the summer of 2013, they took to the streets, millions of people all across Brazil, and they were protesting corruption and wasteful spending and saying, instead of building soccer stadiums in the middle of the Amazon, where nobody's going to go watch a soccer game after the World Cup, Brazil should be investing in education and infrastructure, in its hospitals. And the government listened a little bit. They passed an anti-corruption measure, but they weren't very focused on this, right? And part of that was because the economy wasn't doing well, but part of it was because other scandals were beginning to emerge and were really taking all of the government's focus. So Lava Jato, the car wash corruption scandal, this broke in 2014, the same year that President Dilma Rousseff was running for re-election. So not the greatest news when you're trying to win the public support. This was done through a major state-owned company, oil company, Petrobras, which is one of the largest oil companies in the world. It's like Exxon or Chevron. And essentially, political parties were taking money from this company. So, and this was across the board, right? It wasn't the left, it wasn't the right, it was every political party in Brazil was participating in this, and we're talking billions of dollars. So, as this news was breaking, Brazilian people are like looking at their government and they're saying, well, you know, we don't have good roads, we don't have good schools, and now you're telling us that all this money is being siphoned off. And Rousseff was not able to recover from this, so she was reelected, barely. But her second term was completely mired in scandal and economic problems, and she simply lacked the political skill to navigate that. And it was a hard challenge. And so she was actually impeached in 2006 for crimes of fiscal responsibility, which is basically mismanaging the record keeping, right? She cooked the books a little bit to make the state appear more solvent than it actually was. Her successor, her vice president, who then became president, initially started off well. He did pass some fiscal measures that could have jump-started economic growth, except halfway through his term, he was indicted for corruption. And that just killed all of his political capital. He spent so much effort trying to avoid being impeached himself that he had no political capital left for any sort of policy or legislative proposal. So, at the beginning of 2018, the presidential election year in Brazil, this is where things stand. The economy is limping along. Corruption scandals are breaking every single day across the news. And Brazilians feel like their government hasn't been capable of fulfilling their needs, right? The government is not answering what the people want. And so what we saw is that traditional political parties performed incredibly poorly because people didn't trust them. They felt they knew what these parties had to offer. They'd seen it for years and it wasn't good enough. And so the two candidates who performed really well right off the bat going into the primaries was the center-leftist former President Lula, and that was because he had been president during the boom years. And so people had really good memories of him. They thought, well, you know, he's a politician, he might be corrupt, but, you know, he's a guy who, when he was president, things were better for me. And so even if he's corrupt, I know he cares about me and will advocate for me. Now, Lula was facing corruption charges, and he was actually convicted in January of 2018 and thrown into jail a few weeks later. He continued to run, while in prison. He actually named his vice president, Fernando Haddad, as his personal lawyer because lawyers get as many visits as they want to people in jail. But the electoral court said, no, you can't do that, right? You're in jail for corruption, and there's this law that was passed in response to popular protest, an anti-corruption law that says if you have been convicted of corruption, you cannot run for public office for 10 years. President Lula, I'm sorry, you've been convicted. You cannot run. This ruling came down in September 2018, 1 month before the first round of elections. And so his successor, the vice president, who replaced Lula on the ticket, had 1 month to introduce himself to the Brazilian people. It didn't go so well. The second candidate that was doing really well, who was a far-right populist candidate, was Jair Bolsonaro. And spoiler alert, he's the president of Brazil today. He had spent just under 30 years in Brazil's National Congress, had passed only 2 bills, so not known for his legislative accomplishment. He was known instead for his controversial perspectives, for making statements that made everyone go, ooh, that's not good. And then he also became really well known because he was stabbed at a rally in September, went to the hospital, and then proceeded to use that stabbing as an excuse to not show up to any of the presidential debates and actually face his opponents or take questions about the issues. So he essentially campaigned over Facebook and Twitter. And I want to just go back to the fact that he's a controversial figure because this is incredibly important. And I've put some statements up here. I know some of you in the back might have trouble, so I'll read a few. And this is just a sampling. He said many more things. So he told a fellow congresswoman, the former Minister of Human Rights of Brazil, I would never rape you because you do not deserve it. When a reporter asked him, did you mean to say that? He said, yes. I wouldn't rape her, she's too ugly. He said that women should earn less than men because women get pregnant and then they can't work, and so it makes sense that women should earn less. He said he wasn't worried that his son would fall in love with a black woman because his sons were too well educated for that. And he said, yes, I am homophobic. I'm very proud of it. I would rather my son died than turn out to be gay. And now this is especially troubling because Brazil is a country of profound inequalities still. There's a lot of racial inequality in Brazil. Non-white Brazilians face higher rates of violence, they earn less, they tend to be more poor. And Brazil also has issue with violence against the LGBTQ community. And violence has been increased. It's increased 30% compared to last year. And women's rights and women's equality remain issues that still need to be addressed in Brazil. Brazil has really good laws on the book. It has laws against domestic abuse, against femicide, which is the killing of a woman because of her gender. It even has quotas for women who want to run for office. 30% of political candidates have to be women. But when it comes to implementation, when it comes to the results of these laws, Brazil is still lagging. Brazil has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. 40% of all femicide in Latin America happens in Brazil. Women still earn less than men, and women hold just 15% of Brazil's National Congress. And there were other issues, so this is the general context, but women's rights were really taking off in Brazil in 2018. The Me Too movement had arrived in Brazil. The Brazilian Supreme Court was looking at legalizing abortion. And there were a series of videos on YouTube and shown by major television stations that showed women actually being beaten by their domestic partners. And so this had raised a lot of awareness about the issue. And so when Bolsonaro came along and it became clear that he actually stood a good chance of winning, women took to the streets of Brazil. And they were protesting what he said, and they were protesting what he stood for. But he still won. So this is his agenda, right? And this is why he won. Because as important as issues like the environment and women's rights are, that's not what Brazilians were worried about. That's not what they were facing day to day. They were worried about the economy, which was doing terribly. They were worried about corruption because all of their politicians were corrupt. Some third of the National Congress was under investigation for corruption at this point. They were worried about violence, being mugged in the street or having someone invade their own homes. And so these are the issues that they voted on. And Bolsonaro said, I will open up the economy. I will do pension reform, I will do tax reform, banking reform, you name it, I will do it. I will end corruption, no more business as usual in Brasilia. And I will allow the police to do what they need. I will make access to guns easier. The only good criminal is a bad criminal. That's my motto. So he promised what the people want. The question is, has he actually delivered? He's been on the job for 10 months. What has he accomplished? And when it comes to the economy, he's been off to a good start. So the Brazilian Congress passed pension reform 2 weeks ago. And this was historic because pension reform is always challenging to do, especially in a democracy. But Brazil was struggling to pay the bills. The pension system was going to go bankrupt in the next, depending on which economist you believe and the rate of economic growth, it was going to go bankrupt in 2 to 10 years, right? So it was urgent. And the government predicts savings. And what this did was it sent a signal to the international community, to the World Bank, to the IMF, to international businesses, that Brazil was trying to tackle some of its problems. So we're trying, please come invest in us, it's going to get better. The problem is this was just the beginning. Brazil has a whole host of fiscal and structural reforms that it's going to have to take on if it actually wants to fix the underlying issues that have affected its economy. So how do you have sustainable growth if the quality of education isn't good enough? How do you ship goods to the ports when your roads are terrible and you don't have a good train system? And it's not clear that the president will be able to do this. What we've seen is that in the National Congress, the Speaker of the lower house has actually taken leadership, and he said, these reforms are important, we will work on them. Bolsonaro himself knows they're important because he's been told that. But it seems pretty clear that he doesn't understand it, and he's only going along because he feels like he should. And so for us, looking at that, well, as a president, he's not going to use the power of the bully pulpit to support these reforms, and a lot of them are difficult. A lot of them will have to be sold to the Brazilian people, and it's not clear that he will be able to do that. On the issue of crime rates have fallen. However, police violence has spiked, right? So one of Bolsonaro's points was he wanted to enable the police to do their job, to be more aggressive, and to feel like they were free of any repercussions for police violence. And so unsurprisingly, we've seen that the number of people killed by police is going up, and the number of raids is increasing. And the other thing is, the decline in crime actually isn't due to anything that Bolsonaro did. So part of it is because the drug gangs have changed, and so there's less drug-related violence going on. And the other thing is that in 2018, before Bolsonaro was elected, the government sent the military to Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the most violent cities, and that actually did a lot to reduce crime. On foreign policy, Bolsonaro promised to strengthen relations with the US and, in general, move Brazil in a more right-wing, pro-Christian, pro-West position. And he got off to a good start. He visited Trump in March 2019. It was seen as a win. President Trump was very receptive. They seemed to have a good personal relationship. And then in June of this year, they announced a trade deal between Mercosur, which is a South American trade bloc, and the European Union. And this is something that Brazil has wanted for years. But in general, Brazil's foreign policy has lacked a clear agenda, and within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there seems to be a very chaotic chain of command. Right? There's a number of people who seem to be making foreign policy, from the vice president to the president's sons to, he has this advisor, Olavo de Carvalho, who's a self-professed philosopher, lives in Virginia, and basically thinks that international affairs is a globalist plot, right? And so these are the people who are informing the president of Brazil. And so his response to a lot of international issues has been haphazard. It hasn't been focused, and it really hasn't advanced the interests of Brazil. And then there have been the controversies, with the environment and the situation in the Amazon probably being at the top of that list. As I'm sure many of you saw, Brazil was in the news over the summer, first for deforestation. A lot of the major international papers ran stories about the climbing deforestation rate in Brazil in July. And then by August, the story had shifted not just to deforestation, but to the massive number of forest fires that were happening. Now, the president said that the forest fires were natural, that it was the dry season and this just happens. But that's just not true, right? We know that with no human activity, there are never forest fires in the Amazon. It simply does not happen, dry season or no. So these were very clearly the result of human activities, and it's largely clearing land for agriculture, mining, and forestry. This incident was a significant blow to Brazil's international reputation. Brazil has, since 1992, when it hosted the Earth Summit in Rio, really positioned itself as a leader on environmental issues. And it makes sense, because Brazil has the Amazon, it has the Amazon River, so it should have a seat at the table. It should be a political player. But right now, countries are no longer looking to Brazil for leadership because they know it's not there. And so Brazil has lost a lot of its capacity to be at the table, which you think would be counter to the interests of Brazil. But Bolsonaro has been very focused not on policy making or a constructive agenda. He's been very caught up in a lot of political chaos, a lot of scandals back home in Brasilia. So one son is under investigation for corruption and ties to paramilitary militia. His other son was nominated to be the ambassador to the U.S., faced massive opposition and recently withdrew from that. And both sons are in their late 20s, early 30s. He had a son who recently called for a return to dictatorship era of repression tactics. And there was even an incident where a Brazilian Air Force official, who was part of an official presidential delegation, was pulled over in Spain for smuggling 80 kilos of cocaine. Thankfully not on the presidential jet, but still. And there are some bigger scandals too. The justice minister who prosecuted many of the Lava Jato corruption cases, it was recently revealed that he had actually been collaborating with prosecutors on those very cases, which raised a lot of questions about how fair, how impartial the process has been. And for those of us who follow Brazil, the corruption investigations were one of the bright points, right? This was a country that was tackling its problems, where the rule of law was being upheld, where powerful people were going to jail. And all of a sudden, it comes out that maybe the rule of law wasn't being upheld. Maybe politics was seeping into the process. Yes, a lot of the people probably were corrupt. They probably should have been indicted. But the investigation and these revelations have in many ways undermined faith in the judiciary, which was the last bastion for the Brazilian people, right? They didn't trust the president, they didn't trust Congress. They looked to the judges to protect them and to protect their institutions, and now that also has been lost. Oops. And then lastly, I wanted to bring this in because I think it gives a good indication of how Bolsonaro is seen. So Marielle Franco was a well-known activist in Rio de Janeiro, and she was assassinated. She was someone who really advocated for the Afro-Brazilian community, for the LGBTQ community, and she was killed by 2 members of a paramilitary police militia. Last week, Globo, which is the main television news station in Brazil, published a report connecting President Bolsonaro to the 2 men who stand accused of killing her. It later came out that some of the reporting was not accurate. However, Bolsonaro responded not by issuing a calm denial. He went on live stream, Facebook Live, and over the course of 10 minutes proceeded to scream and cry and threaten to take away Globo's broadcasting license in what looked to us as analysts to really be a meltdown, right? It's not how you would expect the president of a big country to behave. And so this has raised a lot of concerns. Not going to comment. I work for a strictly nonpartisan organization. This has raised a lot of questions about Bolsonaro's ability to act as president and to respond to the many challenges that he is facing. So people are concerned. You know, he has 3 years left of his original mandate. You know, so what's going to happen? Is he going to actually be able to make progress, at least on the economic front, or on corruption, or public security? Or is it just going to continue to get messier and more chaotic? Brazilians aren't holding their breath. His popularity, his disapproval is now higher than his approval ratings. But I don't want to end on a really negative note. I want to end on something a little more positive, and I think it is there. I don't think change, positive change, is going to come from this administration. I do think, however, that the Brazilian people have a lot to give. And Brazilians have becoming more active and more vocal about what they care about. So we've seen a lot of young people, people in their 20s and 30s running for office. And they're stepping forward and saying, we want politics that serves the people. We want politics that is ethical. And I think this is a really great thing to see happening. There's also been a lot of innovation in sustainable development and environmentalism. It's not coming from the government, but we are seeing it among civil society groups and even among big business. Even the agriculture businesses know that this is where the future is headed. And if they don't address climate change, if they are not more sustainable, then, well, that trade deal with the European Union, France is not going to buy Brazilian products. Germany is not, if Brazil doesn't deal with deforestation. And finally, we are seeing recognition among government officials and among the public that Brazil really needs to step up and tackle some of these fiscal and structural issues that have held back its economic development for so long. And so although I think the current president, there's a lot of uncertainty about where this is going to go, I think society has great capacity to move Brazil forward. Thank you.
We are collecting some questions now. We have some time. While some of them come forward, I think we have a good opportunity. Incidentally, if you don't find a card on your table and you want to write on your question on the back of a $20 bill, send it up and make sure you get it back.
Weren't we just talking about corruption?
Second silly comment here. I missed President Bolsonaro's first name. Is it Donald? Hey, all right. Non-partisan as we are. Very good first question here. We are well aware of China moving aggressively throughout Asia and into Africa, but my understanding is that they're moving aggressively into South America as well. It seems like nobody's picking up that vacuum. Maybe we should be. But what is China's role now in Brazil?
So for years, China has invested heavily in Brazil. They've invested a lot of money in infrastructure projects, so ports, roads, the trains. They've invested in energy, and increasingly we're seeing them invest in other areas as well. Jair Bolsonaro actually campaigned on an anti-China platform. He felt like China was buying Brazil, essentially, and he wanted to stop that. But China is Brazil's largest trading partner, right? So it's not so simple. And so what we've seen, that although his rhetoric was really anti-China during the campaign, now that he's been in office, he's been courting the Chinese. So he went to China, many members of his cabinet have gone to China, and they're seeking financial assistance, they're seeking investment, because the economy is not doing well, and the country needs investment, and China has it on offer.
Thank you. Brazil has some of the worst forms of child labor, according to this question, and roughly 30% of Brazil's children are involved. What are the current plans to lower this rate, as you may know about it? And is President Bolsonaro still utilizing the Bolsa to help children get to school?
So I don't know the exact statistics for child labor in Brazil, but certainly it's a country that has real labor issues. I think across the board, there's a large informal sector, and so many of the labor rights that people have in official jobs, you don't see those carried over into the informal sector. Bolsa Familia was a conditional cash transfer program, one of the most successful in the world, and it really expanded in the 2000s under President Lula, and was one of the principal reasons why poverty declined so much. And what that program did was it gave a monthly stipend, a bolsa, to families across Brazil who were below a certain income threshold. And in order to receive that money, they had to prove that their kids were attending school and that their kids were getting vaccinated. So pretty simple, but very, very effective at expanding access to education, expanding vaccination rates, and just helping families escape poverty. Now, Bolsa Familia has unfortunately not kept up with inflation. So the stipend, as it stands right now, is significantly less than it was, 10, 15 years ago. It's actually an incredibly low-cost way to produce the results it produces. But Bolsonaro is on the right, and he sees this as it's government welfare, right? He would like to see the market, I think, solve these solutions. And so I don't think he'll end Bolsa Familia because it's very, very popular still, but he has not prioritized it. And in fact, none of the candidates in 2018 prioritized it. And I found this really odd because 40 million Brazilians have used the program. And that's a huge portion of the electorate. And so it was really interesting to see that none of the candidates were really standing up and saying, we need to expand this program, we need to make it work again for families. But I think there has been so much focus at the political level on kind of the macroeconomics, right? How do you reform the economy at the highest level? And there has not, as of yet, been a lot of attention given to how do we help all Brazilians, especially people who are middle class or poor, have better lives.
Thank you. When you spoke to the students at Governor Mifflin this morning, you noted the point of this particular question here. What is Brazil doing, or what is the relationship Brazil may have with Venezuela, and how is it involved in the total situation in Venezuela?
So for many years, under Lula and under his successor Dilma Rousseff, who was impeached, they were both members of the leftist Workers' Party. So they maintained very positive relations with Venezuela, which was also governed by a leftist government. When Bolsonaro was elected, he's obviously from the right, and very anti-Venezuela, anti the current government. So he strongly supported so there were elections, Maduro, who's the president of Venezuela, was re-elected, and many observers felt that these elections were fraudulent, that the votes had been stolen. The president of Venezuela's National Assembly, Juan Guaido, came out and said, well, I've been elected, and under the Constitution, if the presidential ticket, the president and the vice president, stole the election, then they are illegitimate and I should be president, right? So we've had two people claiming the presidency. And Maduro, who has become increasingly authoritarian, had the military behind him, the Venezuelan military. And then Guaido, who was claiming the presidency, basically had international support. Right? The US was on his side, the European Union was on his side, and Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro was on his side. Now Bolsonaro came out and said, well, if Maduro, the leftist authoritarian, does not leave, well, maybe we'll send in the Brazilian military, right? And he said this, and the Brazilian generals were like, no. We're not doing that, right? We're not invading Venezuela. Brazil has a strict policy of non-intervention. You know, this is not something we're going to do. And so there was some back and forth, and there was some debate internally within the administration, which really played out publicly, over what Brazil would do. And in the end, Brazil did very little, right? They certainly did not send in the troops. They didn't do much more than issue a strongly worded statement. But what this demonstrated was a lot of the tensions within the president's inner circle. So there's a group of like the generals, as we call them, right? Former, current military officials. There's Bolsonaro's sons, who tend to be more ideological, very active on social media. There's the technocrats, the people who have substantive expertise, like his economics minister. And then there's the evangelicals and the conservative social group. And these are really the people who are fighting amongst themselves to control Brazil's domestic and its foreign agenda.
I think you've already addressed these next two questions, but see if you want to add anything. Is Brazil going into debt at this time, or is the economy recovering?
So the economy is limping along. It grew at about 1% last year and looks set to do something similar this year, which is not nearly enough, right? Over 13 million Brazilians are unemployed, and the country itself only has 200 million people, so that's a significant portion of the economy. Brazil is running a deficit, a small deficit, each year, right? And so it actually does have a large amount of debt. I think it's about 70% of GDP, maybe 80%, which is considered hefty. You know, it's a lot, but it's not unmanageable, especially if Brazil can return to a path of economic growth. It will be able to pay down that national debt.
Well, I think in the U.S., I think that percentage of GDP is something like 50%. So, but it's not like Japan, as I understand it, where it's like 90%. So.
Well, there's a former Brazilian ambassador, Brazilian ambassador to the U.S., Rubens Recupero, who likes to say, every country has a certain number of mistakes it can make, right? Every country, there's a certain amount of screw-ups you can have before the rest of the world is like, that's a little too much. And I think on the economy, it's like that, right? So Argentina right now, it's at the end of its rope. Brazil isn't there yet, thankfully.
Again, you've addressed this somewhat, but see if you want to add anything. Is the Brazilian Congress set up like the U.S., two parties or more? Does the president have support from Congress?
So the Brazilian Congress, there is a Senate and a lower house, just like we have in the U.S., but there's 30 to 35 parties, depending on the year. So traditionally, what has happened is that the president, his or her party, has a chance to form a governing coalition in Congress. So in a sense, it's almost parliamentary because there are so many parties. And so they form a governing coalition, and it usually skews center-right or center-left. Very rarely does it go to the extremes. That's how it traditionally works. Bolsonaro has not managed to form a governing coalition. Part of this is because he's very anti-horse trading, right? He was elected on an anti-corruption mandate, that he wouldn't do politics as usual, and he's stuck to his guns. But what it's meant is that the usual perks that you would offer parties to join your coalition, like cabinet seats or good positions at the ministries, he has not been giving out, and so parties aren't willing to play ball. So instead, we've seen that Congress has come up with its own governing coalition, if you will, that has implemented some of the government's proposals, but it has vetoed others. Right? So it's a very interesting situation right now. This has not happened in Brazil since the return to democracy. But Congress is gaining a lot more power, and the executive branch is losing power.
We do have some time. We have 2 more questions here we can ask you to address all we've received today, which is very nice. Are the people in the Amazon still under attack, as well as the environment? Again, you may have addressed some of these points.
So the situation in the Amazon is still serious. Forest fires, the rate is down. In large part, that's because we're now entering the rainy season, and so there simply aren't as many fires, right? And farmers will often look to clear their land during the dry season, simply because it's easier, right, to start the fires. It's also harder to control them. So even legal fires set under lands that are approved of, certified for agriculture, they can get out of control, right, and you can end up burning down a large swath. So in terms of deforestation, that's still a real problem, and it is still going on, even though the fires have diminished. People who live in the Amazon face their own threats. So the Amazon is home to millions of people, actually. We tend to think of the Amazon as being this vast wilderness, but it actually does have a quite sizable population, and some of these are traditional populations, so indigenous groups, or quilombola groups, which are the descendants of escaped African enslaved people who were brought to Brazil. And some are Brazilians who moved there, during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when the government was really promoting development in the region. The indigenous groups in the quilombolas, they have a historic right to their land, and this is granted to them under the 1998 Constitution. But that right is not always respected. So we'll see, illegal mining or illegal logging, or even cattle ranching moving into spaces that are actually protected territories. And troublingly, the Brazilian government under Bolsonaro earlier this year reduced a lot of the resources that go towards protecting these communities and protecting the environment in the Amazon region. Bolsonaro actually tried to get rid of the agency that FUNAI, that takes care of and monitors indigenous groups. So for him, it's not a priority. He sees indigenous communities and the right to their land as standing in the way of development. And so because of that, because from the very top, you're getting a sense that this is not important, we're seeing that illegal activities are increasing, right? People on the ground feel like they have room. They feel like the government's not going to come after them if they do it. So we are actually seeing that the situation on the ground is getting worse.
Okay, final question, and maybe I'll add a little second part to this. This morning, if you did hear when I was standing up, I don't remember, you were concluding with how the people in Brazil view the United States. And before we get to that, though, how is President Trump viewed by the people of Brazil? And then how is people in the United States viewed generally?
So Bolsonaro himself really admires President Trump. He modeled his campaign after Trump's campaign deliberately in terms of the use on social media, rallying the base through polarizing social issues. So he really followed the Trump playbook. And so for people who support Bolsonaro, and His base in Brazil is about 30% of the population, right, are very strong Bolsonaro supporters, and probably always will be, no matter what happens. For these people, they look to Trump as someone that they approve of, someone that they admire. Many Brazilians, however, I think probably a large chunk of the population, looks to the US and sees what's happening as being a mess, right? That the US is no longer living up to its role of leadership, that there is, a vacuum being created. And historically, I think Brazilians have been hot and cold when it comes to the US government, right? Brazilians, as a whole, tend to skew more left than the United States. If you look at the spectrum of political parties, what they see as center-right, we would see as being center-left, right? So they're just skewed in that way. So I would say in general, people liked Obama quite a bit. They liked Bush less, in part because of the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as I mentioned, Brazil is very staunchly anti-intervention of any type. But Brazilians in general are very good at separating governments from the people. So even during the periods where they maybe didn't approve of US foreign policy or like the US president, I think Brazilians have always felt an affinity for the US, and they like Americans. I've always found the country to be incredibly welcoming, and I think there's a real love of US culture. They love Disney. It's really popular for children on their 15th birthday to go to Disney World in Orlando. So it's a part of growing up, looking to US culture, to US history, and seeing that there are ties there. And some of this is historic, as I mentioned this morning. When Brazil became a republic, the first name they chose for themselves was the United States of Brazil. It later changed to the Federative Republic of Brazil. And the first embassy they opened was in the United States. And in World War II, Brazil actually sent troops and fought alongside the United States in Africa and Italy. So there are these historic connections, and I think Brazilians remember that, and they always do look to the United States to be there as a partner. We don't always get along government to government, but I think the ties between our societies and our private sectors are incredibly strong and vibrant.
Well, I think that music was a signal that our time is concluded.